breaking a custody deal was signed, sealed, and barely dry before Prince Harry detonated the silence with accusations so explosive they scorched Meghan and dragged Prince Andrew's shadow back into the royal inferno. And now, the monarchy is scrambling to contain a scandal that feels less like divorce and more like a declaration of war. It was supposed to be clean, clinical, a quiet agreement behind closed doors in Santa Barbara, inked with lawyers present and assistants dismissed, the kind of structured resolution designed to prevent exactly this kind of public bloodbath. But within days of that custody deal being signed, whispers began leaking from Montecito, from London, from corridors that don't just echo, they remember. And at the center of it all stood Harry, no longer the defiant exile prince, no longer the silent partner in Meghan's global reinvention, but a man who appeared to be unraveling in real time, pulling threads that led straight to Meghan, and shockingly to Andrew, the document itself was airtight on the surface. Joint custodial framework, structured travel windows, educational oversight clauses, non-commercialization safeguards for Archie and Lilibet. The kind of language meant to stop the children from becoming bargaining chips. But if the paperwork was peace, Harry's next move was pure combustion, because almost immediately after the signatures were secured, Harry began privately alleging that Meghan had not only breached the spirit of the agreement, but had been operating behind his back in ways he now described as unthinkable. According to insiders, he told confidants that the custody structure was only necessary because he had discovered strategic positioning involving the children's image rights, offshore partnerships, and conversations that made him question everything he thought he knew about their future. And then came the Andrew bombshell. It started as a murmur inside palace-adjacent legal circles. Harry had allegedly referenced past royal failures in a heated exchange, invoking Andrew's long history of controversy as an example of what happens when institutions protect image over truth. But that wasn't the end of it. According to a senior source, Harry went further in private, suggesting that the same old guard complacency that shielded Andrew for years was now being weaponized against him, twisting narratives, isolating him, painting him unstable for wanting more control over his children's upbringing. The implication? That Meghan had been quietly aligning with figures who understood how to manipulate royal optics, learning from the worst chapters of Windsor survival. That's when the situation turned radioactive, because Andrew's name inside any fresh royal dispute is like striking a match in a room filled with gas. The monarchy has spent years trying to minimize his footprint, trying to bury headlines, trying to move forward. And now Harry, blood prince, son of the king, was dragging that name back into daylight in connection with his own marital collapse. It wasn't a direct accusation of misconduct. It was more insidious than that. It was a comparison, a warning, a suggestion that power structures within the palace had long tolerated behavior that damaged reputations, and that he refused to let his children be entangled in similar institutional blind spots. Meanwhile, Meghan's camp was furious. Sources close to her described Harry's post-custody outburst as strategic chaos, a calculated attempt to destabilize her brand pivot in Dubai and Paris by painting her as reckless and manipulative. They pointed to the signed custody agreement as proof that legal professionals had found no emergency threat, no imminent danger, nothing that justified Harry's sudden moral crusade. If there was something unthinkable, they argued, why sign? Why agree? Why not fight it in court? But that's exactly what makes this story so volatile, because according to the file that set this entire drama ablaze, Harry had already been laying groundwork long before the ink dried. There were prior filings, emergency clarifications, attempts to reclassify residency, moves to freeze image rights, requests for DINA confirmations tied to inheritance structures, a pattern that now looks less like a spontaneous meltdown and more like a slow-building siege. The custody deal may have been signed, but Harry's trust had already fractured. Drawn inside Montecito, the atmosphere reportedly turned glacial. Staff divided, security tightened, separate wings occupied. The image of a united Sussex household dissolved into something colder, transactional. And while Meghan moved forward with high-profile investor meetings and carefully curated public appearances, Harry's focus narrowed obsessively to two names, Archie and Lilibet. He began speaking about legacy risk, about narrative contamination, about ensuring that no future tell-all, no commercial venture, no foreign partnership could define his children before they were old enough to define themselves. That's when Andrew's specter returned again, because in one particularly explosive private exchange, Harry allegedly argued that the monarchy's greatest recent humiliation wasn't rebellion, it was denial. That the refusal to confront Andrew swiftly and decisively had weakened the institution's moral authority, and he refused, he said, to let his own children become casualties of image management. Whether that was aimed at Meghan, the palace, or both remains unclear. But the timing, days after signing custody papers, felt deliberate. Publicly, the palace stayed silent. No comment, no denial. No acknowledgement of Andrew's name being dragged into this fresh storm. But internally, aides were said to be livid. The last thing the crown needed was a reopened wound. And yet, here it was, Harry forcing a comparison that made headlines inevitable. Online, speculation ignited. Was Harry accusing Meghan of leveraging palace vulnerabilities? Was he hinting that private conversations about royal protection had included references to how Andrew's crisis was handled? Or was this simply a man spiraling under the weight of divorce, fatherhood, and exile? What made it worse was Harry's tone in recent private messages that leaked through secondary channels. He wasn't speaking like a man seeking reconciliation. He was speaking like someone who believed he had been strategically cornered, that the custody agreement was necessary damage control, but not the end of the war. He reportedly told one confidant, "I signed for stability, not silence," a line that now echoes like a warning shot. And Meghan? She didn't respond directly, but she didn't retreat either. Instead, she accelerated. Appearances multiplied, business announcements sharpened, a new branding language emphasizing sovereignty, reinvention, independence. It looked less like defeat and more like defiance, which only fueled Harry's narrative that image was being prioritized over introspection. Meanwhile, Andrew remained officially absent. No public statement, no visible involvement. But the mere invocation of his name dragged this custody dispute into a darker historical context. Because Andrew represents the monarchy's most painful lesson about unchecked privilege. And by drawing that parallel, Harry effectively reframed his personal custody battle as an institutional reckoning. Was that fair? Was it manipulative? Or was it strategic desperation? That's the question tearing through royal circles right now. Because if the custody deal was meant to close a chapter, Harry's accusations have instead cracked open an entirely new volume, one where Meghan is painted as dangerously ambitious, Andrew becomes a cautionary ghost, and the monarchy is forced to confront its own past while trying to secure its future. The signed agreement was supposed to bring order. Instead, it triggered chaos. And if this is how part 1 ends, with Harry accusing, Meghan maneuvering, and Andrew's name resurrected, then the next phase won't be about paperwork. It will be about power. Because once Harry's accusations escaped the walls of Montecito and echoed through London, the monarchy did what it has always done best when threatened: it closed ranks. But this time, it wasn't just about protecting the crown. It was about deciding whether Harry himself had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The custody deal had been signed. The children's schedules were mapped, travel windows established, media usage restricted. But instead of calming tensions, Harry's invocation of Andrew and his insinuations about institutional blindness turned a domestic dispute into a constitutional migraine. Behind palace gates, emergency consultations reportedly unfolded with icy precision. Senior advisors combed through Harry's recent communications, assessing not only legal risk, but reputational contagion. Because when a prince suggests that the monarchy's past failures could repeat through negligence, that is not merely marital drama. That is a direct challenge to royal credibility. And credibility is the one currency the crown cannot afford to devalue. Meanwhile, in California, Harry doubled down. He began briefing select legal analysts, not through official statements, but through contextual clarifications, reinforcing his position that his post-custody accusations were not emotional outbursts, but protective alarms. He framed Meghan's recent international dealings as jurisdictionally complex. He raised questions about advisory influences surrounding her. He hinted, carefully, almost surgically, that conversations had occurred involving figures who understood how to navigate royal scandal because they had survived it before. He never accused Andrew of involvement in Meghan's life. He didn't have to. The suggestion was enough. The internet did the rest. Speculation spiraled. Commentators dissected every prior Sussex interview. Old footage resurfaced. Royal analysts debated whether Harry was courageously confronting systemic complacency or recklessly torching his own bridge back to Windsor. And through it all, the children remained the silent epicenter. 2 names repeated in legal filings, trust amendments, and protective clauses, while the adults waged ideological warfare over their future. Meghan, for her part, shifted tactics. The sovereign entrepreneur narrative intensified. Interviews avoided direct references to Harry, but emphasized themes of narrative control and breaking inherited cycles. It was subtle, but unmistakable. She wasn't presenting herself as the villain in Harry's custody crusade. She was positioning herself as the woman who refused to let ancient institutions define modern motherhood. Privately, however, sources say she was stunned by the Andrew comparison. Not because it implicated her in wrongdoing, but because it suggested Harry no longer viewed their struggle as united against the palace. He was now triangulating, critiquing both her and the monarchy simultaneously. And that, insiders claim, was the true fracture. Because once a man begins framing himself as the only moral constant between two flawed systems, his wife and his birthright, reconciliation becomes nearly impossible. In London, the palace adopted a colder strategy, strategic silence paired with quiet containment. Andrew was kept entirely out of public view. No events, no appearances, no opportunities for reporters to link his name organically to Harry's insinuations. At the same time, legal teams reviewed the custody agreement's language to ensure no clauses could be interpreted as tacit palace endorsement of Harry's accusations. The monarchy would not be weaponized as leverage in a California dispute, but Harry wasn't finished. In what one insider described as a point of no-return conversation, he reportedly communicated through intermediaries that if he felt his children's image or legal standing was compromised by commercial positioning, he would pursue further restrictions, even if that meant challenging elements of the custody agreement he had just signed. That move stunned observers. Why sign a deal only to threaten reopening it? The answer, according to those close to him, was painfully simple. He believed he had signed for stability, not surrender. And here's where the psychological layer deepens. Harry has spent years navigating two realities, the royal heir and the royal exile. In the palace, loyalty is currency. In California, independence is branding. His marriage initially thrived on rejecting one for the other, but now, with custody formalized and accusations launched, he appears trapped between both worlds, seeking institutional validation while condemning institutional failure. It is a paradox that only intensifies under public scrutiny. The Andrew shadow lingers, because it represents the monarchy's greatest cautionary tale about denial and damaged control. By invoking it, Harry forced the crown to confront whether its silence strategy protects children or protects optics. And that question is dangerous because it resonates beyond his own family. Legal analysts now speculate that the next battlefield won't be about custody percentages, but about narrative restraint clauses. If Harry continues referencing royal precedent in ways that reignite past scandals, the palace could theoretically distance itself further, reinforcing boundaries around title usage and representational authority. Conversely, if Meghan perceives Harry's public insinuations as defamatory or strategically destabilizing to her ventures, she could push for mediation amendments emphasizing mutual non-disparagement. In simpler terms, the war may shift from who protects the children to who controls the story about protection. And that battle is far more ruthless. Montecito remains tense. Reports suggest separate professional teams, limited direct communication, conversations routed through counsel, the intimacy of partnership replaced by the bureaucracy of coexistence. It is not yet open warfare, but it is no longer trust. The tragedy beneath the spectacle is that both narratives contain fragments of truth. Meghan is undeniably building an independent empire. Harry is undeniably haunted by institutional failure. But when ambition and anxiety collide inside a custody framework, every move feels like betrayal. The monarchy, watching from across the Atlantic, understands something else. This is no longer just about Harry and Meghan. It is about precedent. If a royal-born child raised outside the UK becomes central to international commercial narratives, what authority does the crown retain? And if a prince publicly equates past palace failures with present marital conflict, how does the institution respond without escalating? That is the quiet chess match unfolding now. Harry's accusations of the unthinkable were never clearly defined, and perhaps that is intentional. Vague enough to alarm, specific enough to sting, broad enough to implicate patterns rather than individuals. It keeps Meghan defensive. It keeps Andrew ghost-like. And it keeps the palace unsettled. But ambiguity is a dangerous strategy. Because if you accuse without clarifying, you risk appearing unstable. If you compare without proving, you risk looking vindictive. And if you weaponize history, you may find history weaponized against you. So where does this leave the signed custody deal that started it all? Ironically, it remains legally intact. The structure stands. The children's schedules continue. The paperwork is valid. But emotionally, symbolically, politically, it has been detonated. What was meant to close a chapter has instead rewritten the narrative of Harry's post-royal life. He is no longer simply the prince who left for love. nor just the husband defending his wife against institutional coldness. He is now the father accusing, the son comparing, the exile invoking the very system he once condemned. That transformation is seismic in Meghan. She faces a crossroads of her own: lean into reinvention and risk appearing detached, confront Harry publicly and risk escalating, or remain silent and allow his accusations to calcify in public imagination. The monarchy will wait. It always waits. It understands that storms burn themselves out or burn their creators first, but this storm feels different because this time the custody deal wasn't the end of conflict. It was the ignition switch. And as long as Harry believes there are unthinkable forces shaping his children's future, whether commercial, institutional, or psychological, he won't retreat quietly. The question now is not whether the agreement holds. The question is whether the relationships behind it survive. And in a dynasty built on legacy, survival is everything.